Welcome to Mythology. I am Dr. Maria Kempinska, and my guest and my partner in this particular series of mythology is Dr. Anastasios Gaetanides, who is also a professor. He teaches over here in Regent's University in London and in Greece, which is very exciting. That's why he's brown and I'm pale. I've just come out of the winter sun, and Anastasios is going into the winter sun, which is lovely for him. And it's wonderful to have you here again. We're talking this time about King Midas.
Yes, King Midas. Yes, what a great myth for our times, right? You know?
Absolutely, and we have so many to choose from. And we decided that King Midas, it might be the perfect time to talk about King Midas. So what I'll do is I'll give a very, as brief as an introduction to the story as possible of King Midas, who was, of course, as we know, the man with the golden touch.
Yes.
This was a king who absolutely was a pleasure-loving king. And they say that he ruled over Brigians. Now, this was in Asia Minor, which was Anatolia, sort of
Anatolia, yes, that's that
sort of area. It's always, it's changed so much that you have to understand the geography. And he was the first person to plant a rose garden, and he loved spending his days feasting and listening to music. Of course he did. And, he was a king, so why shouldn't he? They say that his mother was Rhea or Cybele. Do you call her Sibyl? Sibyl,
yeah.
So the mother of the gods. And when he was a baby, it is said that a procession of ants was seen carrying grains of wheat up to the side of his cradle and placing them between his lips as he slept. When the oracles were asked to explain the omen, they said that Midas was a special child who would amass great power and wealth. Aren't the oracles wonderful? So let's bear in mind that most of the myths were so impactful because they were around God, around kings and queens, those people of power. And it's about power, and it's about people in high places. King Midas had a rose garden, which was celebrated. And on one particular occasion, Dionysus, who was the god of wine, otherwise known as Bacchus in the as a Roman god, he and his army were going to India via Asia Minor, and part of his army, he had some satyrs, which were half men, half goats. And one of these satyrs was somebody who was sort of his mentor, who's educating him, was Silenus. Now, as we know, the god of wine, Dionysus, was a god of wine, of lust, of sexual favors, of grapes, of just having fun. He was the big party god. And on this particular occasion, they were close to King Midas's palace, and Silenus was drunk. He'd drunk too much, and he wandered away from the rest of the army and fell asleep in King Midas's palace. The following morning, when he was waking up, King Midas's retinue found him and took him to King Midas. And he spoke to King Midas and regaled King Midas with stories about Dionysus' army and where they'd traveled and the great accomplishments that they'd had. And it took him 10 days to tell these stories. After 10 days, he was now sober. Silenus was taken back to Dionysus. Now, Dionysus was so dependent on Silenus, that he was delighted that Midas had looked after him and called to all his retinue to get Midas to come over and meet him, and offered him a prize and said, "What would you like? I would like to give you a gift for being so amazing and looking after my friend." Because Dionysus couldn't have continued without him. It was much like in those days, sort of Alexander the Great had Aristotle with him as his mentor. So they would have one person that would guide them, make sure they were okay, making sure they made decisions in the right way. And this is Silenus. when Dionysus said, I'm going to give you a gift for looking after my friend and rescuing him and making sure he's okay, King Midas, being the impulsive man that he was, he said, I would like to touch, everything I touch would turn to gold. And Dionysus said, are you absolutely sure? And Midas said, of course. You know, I've got my bed of roses. I've got a daughter who loves me. My kingdom is thriving. What else do I want? Gold. Of course I do. And so Dionysus said, okay, let's go ahead. And he gave him this wonderful gift of everything that he touched was going to be turned to gold. Dionysus, Midas then went into his rose garden and picked up one of his roses, and it immediately turned to gold. That's wonderful, he thought. And then he sat down by an apple tree, reached up for an apple, and it turned to gold. And then he saw a nightingale, reached up to touch it, and it also turned to gold. After a period of time of doing this, he decided he was hungry. He went to his banqueting hall and sat down to have something to eat, and it also turned to gold. Decided he was going to have something to drink, and that too turned to gold. So suddenly there was this man where everything that was going to be a luxury and everything that was going to be golden, but suddenly he couldn't eat or drink. So his own nourishment had gone. His daughter noticed this and she was alarmed. She rushed over to her father and thought, my father, he's not going to be nourished. He's never going to eat. And as she wrapped her arms around her father, she too turned to gold. And at this point, King Midas realized he'd made a mistake. He was totally heartbroken. What can I do? So he went over and he found Dionysus and said, thank you so much for giving me this gift, but I've made a mistake. My daughter is now turned to gold and I want her back. Dionysus, who was actually a nice god, a kind god, reckless, fun-loving, lustful, but he was a good god. And he said, I realize what you've done. So what I suggest you do is you must go to the river, which was called Patroclus, and you must bathe in the river, but also take your daughter. And when you bathe, the gold will come off and you'll be restored. But more than this, he also gave him, because he was so pleased that he had, Midas had helped him find Silenus, who was very important to Dionysus. He said, I'm going to help you become king of Phrygia, which actually was a place. And he helped Midas become king of Phrygia, not through any untoward reason, but the king of Phrygia at that moment actually died and Midas took over. And it was all very amicable. It wasn't done in a bad way. It wasn't done through death and destruction like some of the other myths. But he actually found his place there. And it was all because of the goodness of Dionysus. And as time went on, Midas then became the king with the psychology of somebody who is the king. And as time went on, there was a very famous sort of, let's say, battle of the bands. And this time it was between Apollo and a normal mortal called Midas. And Midas had found a flute that Athena had created. And this flute, whoever played it, became an accomplished musician.
Yes.
And Apollo decided that they would have a competition. And the judge happened to be King Midas. And this is where King Midas became the normal human being. He had become a king. He could now decide between Apollo, who is a god, and Midas, who is a normal mortal who had been given the gift of being a fabulous musician by Athena and the flute. Both of them played, and Midas decided that Midas was going to be the winner. Apollo wasn't happy with this and called him an ass and gave him ass's ears. King Midas decided he was going to hide his ears, quite rightly, and his barber was the only one that knew about his ears because he put on a cap. And There was a name for the cat, the Phrygian cat, that's right. But he told his barber never to tell anybody, as long as he wore the cap. Nobody could see that he had these hairy, long, dangly ass's ears. And however, the barber, true to the human psychological condition, couldn't hold in this story, and he decided to tell it to the reeds. But the reeds, much like social media, decided to tell everybody, and they amplified the story, and soon everybody got to know that King Midas himself was an ass. So most of us know the story, so we'll end it there. There's a little bit more to it, but most of us know the story of King Midas and the Midas touch. And you've even got Forbes, 100 Midas 100 or 200 Midas. And we often talk about the Midas touch. They can turn something from nothing into gold. And yet, what happens when you start believing in your own power? And we see this over and over again, don't we, in mythology?
Yes.
For that moment of hubris, that moment when you become bigger than the gods, you are taken down and you're made a fool of here. And I think what I like about the story, although it's almost like a child's fairy tale, it actually tells you exactly how the gods felt about it.
Yes, but also it shows, that something about human impulsivity and the sense of deciding on the spur of the moment. This is a narcissism in a way, and greed. Greed, he had everything and he wanted more. He wasn't satisfied with, actually using his wish to benefit someone else. He had everything, so he wanted more than everything. He could have been satisfied and content with what he had, but no, it wasn't enough. He wanted to be the richest man in the world. That's why he decided that everything that he was touching, that he will turn into gold. And that's perhaps his downfall in a way. It was his downfall until, of course, Dionysus took pity on him and restored him by telling him to wash himself in the river Pactylos together with his daughter. But fundamentally, there is something about this impulsivity, the sense of, I don't care about anything else. I just want everything for myself. And that's the nature of greed. Greed doesn't care about anything and anyone. I only care about myself. I remember, and in that sense, it's very destructive because in many ways, it doesn't take consideration of the other as well. I mean, it's different from jealousy and it's different from envy, but it's equally destructive. It's equally destructive because it's a relationship with one, greed.
And it's interesting because Melanie Klein talks about greed, doesn't she?
Yeah, and it distinguishes it between jealousy and envy, for example. She says that greed is a relationship that involves only one, the person who experienced the greed. It doesn't. The example that I give, and actually is an example of my own greed. I remember having this beautiful tiramisu made for me, a whole tray of a tiramisu, right, made by a friend who makes an excellent tiramisu. And of course, we kept it in the fridge for tomorrow morning. So we have, me, my wife, and friends will have, a piece of tiramisu. So I went down in the night and I opened the fridge and I saw this beautiful tiramisu and I couldn't stop myself, And I ate most of it and I left only one piece. Right. So, in that moment, the impulsivity was like I only thinking about me and my own desire. Yeah. My wife, my friends, and nobody existed. It was only me and my greed. I want it all and I want it now. That's what greed is, right?
But this is so interesting, you saying that, because we still have that as grown-ups, but when Melanie Klein talks about it, it's actually as a child. It's almost as if if you're not given that food as a child, if you're not allowed to experience your greed, and if it's not moderated at that age, it will develop into narcissism and overwhelming self-importance and desire. It's not regulated, along with envy and jealousy and all.
Or if it is encouraged, like in the case of Midas, right? That he was encouraged, it was special. You are special. you
Yeah.
know? When, people, when the kids, I said, it's interesting because it's almost like we deal with like babies, His Majesty the baby, right?
Yes.
His Majesty the baby.
Mm.
And if you start treating it like that, then it becomes, does things that the world owns, owns him. The world is there as a resource instead of something that he needs to be in a kind of a relationship with, as a supply, more or less, and as a narcissistic supply for one's own greed. That's why the other doesn't exist. The other becomes a narcissist. They become really dangerous people because not because intentionally they use others as supplies, not as other subjects of their love. There is no love. I just want it all and I want it for myself, and you don't exist. And as long as you stand in my way, you also, you're going to be turned into my enemy.
Yeah, but that's on the extreme. And this is such an important point because we talk about the attachment period, first 3 years, and this is where Melanie Klein and all of the sort of deep psychological thinkers talk about this. Is that very early period of attachment. And also, but that period, it's not just attachment, it's seeing the other. Who is the other in our lives? How do we as parents, or how does the caregiver relate to the child? And as you say, there is the golden child, the special child, and do no wrong, and how dangerous that is. But if they're not taught to empathize, if they're taught that the parent is a narcissist, they have to serve the narcissist, what did it turn them into? Or when if they are, if anything can happen, the Machiavellian notion also, does it start at that age when they start manipulating to get what they want? Or becoming, psychotic, or, sort of without any feeling for the other person? At what point does it start? And is it an omen, like the ants that come and actually feed the baby to make them special? Ways that the person is born and the ability to empathize is taken away, or is it there naturally? Do children need to be taught to empathize? And how bad does your child have to be for you to lose that ability to empathize?
I think, empathy is something that, in my view, is something that it is developed, it's something that you acquire, and it's something that comes out of contact with an empathic parent who keeps you in mind, but not, but also not spoils you, not treat you as special, in order to use you as a kind of narcissistic supply for their own needs, right? Because that's when to treat you as a special kid, as a golden child, it's almost like, they treat you like that because they benefit out of if you are special, you're special for them.
Yes.
Not because you are special, right? As a separate child, as a separate individual, you're only special in relation to their own needs and what they need you for. So you already learn that you are simply a kind of narcissistic supply for your parents. And of course, you either develop a kind of submissive personality that becomes quite subservient to someone else's needs, or you identify with a narcissist and you become narcissistic yourself. And that can be very dangerous because, in many ways you start seeing others only as things that can give you, what you need, and not as separate individuals. And that can cause a lot of damage, because the moment it's almost like they use people as drugs, as a drug.
Yeah.
You are used as a drug, as a supply. You are not really exist there as an individual with your own needs and desires. And that the moment that you are not performing that role, then they either dump you, or they move on to the next supply.
And also, I think what is so difficult, and I don't like pouring the power onto parents so it scares them to the point, but there is that scary element of how important parents are. And I think at the moment, because women's lives and men's lives in many ways has become easier, the child becomes so important. And I heard when my children were growing up, you know, certain mothers saying, oh, my child, he's 5, he's reading, he's going to be the next Einstein, and so on. You know, and then it all sort of comes out at 13 that they're quite normal. And I think this is the danger if somebody doesn't have their own sense of themselves or have their own entity, their own agency, as you say. You know, if they don't develop themselves and they depend on their child to be an expression of themselves. Or if a child isn't a good enough expression of you.
Yes.
You know, a child could be identified with a parent or a person in your life that you didn't like.
Yeah. Oh my God. Then God help that child. But there is the traumatic element that is involved in kind of the criticism, disapproval, the rejection. So I think there is, you know, there is pathological narcissism, and there's also traumatizing narcissism that the parent can exhibit, which is the one that, you know, leaves the child in a kind of double bind, which is, on the one hand, you know, they make the child feel shamed and ashamed and embarrassed for wanting to depend. And neediness in the child is recognized as something shameful. So they shame the child for feeling needy. Stop being so needy, right? Stop. What do you want from me? But then the moment that the child tries to move and find something else or somewhere else to be independent, then, you know, they become angry, rejecting, you know, no, you can't do that either. So you can't be dependent, you can't be needy, you can't be independent either. So you are stuck in this limbo.
Yeah, it's so interesting because R.D. Laing wrote his book about the double bind, the divided self, and also he wrote a play called Knots.
Yeah.
And that's all about I love you, you love because you love me, and you love me because I love you. Yes. And it's that, as we're talking about, into which can happen in later, obviously, in relationships, but in the mother-child or father-child as well. You know, sort of who does the child represent? And as long as the child loves you, they're there for you, but they are only there if they do what you want them to do. That's and they cannot be an expression of themselves. That is so dangerous.
Very dangerous. And of course, you know, I want to say that, you know, treating the child at the beginning of its life as something, you know, important and special is significant as well. But if you carry on doing that without, you know, there's something about you that want to maintain that specialness that is not about the child anymore. Because fundamentally there needs to be disillusion from that sort of initial stage of omnipotence, or stage of, you know, to realize that there are other, you know, human beings like the mother, the father, the siblings or others, that they have needs, and, you know, and is important, but is not the only important person in the family, right? It's not the center of the universe, and his needs are not more important than others. And of course, to make that to socialize someone into that, it needs, you know, it needs a kind of optimal frustration and an optimal disillusionment instead of a failure in provision, which sometimes becomes very impinging and very traumatizing, you know, which of course leads to the, you know, I mean, narcissists themselves, you know, Midas, they a greedy person, they don't become greedy out of nothing, right? They become narcissistic out of nothing. They become because they are very traumatized and deprived people themselves, right? And they want everything and anything right now, and they cannot wait. They're impulsive. They don't have any. They feel rage when there's not given what they want. No, I want it now, and if you withhold it, then they become enraged with you. So there is something about that shows, but there is something in that story as well that in many ways makes Midas a little bit more with the love for his daughter. When he realizes what happens to his daughter, then he really repents. But he's not, you know, he doesn't keep this repentance going. He doesn't feel remorse. I mean, he doesn't count his lucky stars. You know, I think Dionysus has been too good, actually.
Yes, I agree.
You know, he should have punished.
He's too grateful.
He's too grateful, and he shouldn't have given him everything back. You know, he gets everything back. He becomes the king. He enjoys his kingdom, and then, you know, he becomes hubristic again when he chooses, to, when he praises, he chooses the model of Apollo again, right? And so he feels that he's important enough to pass judgment over good, right? That you are not as good enough, I choose someone else, a simple sort of mortal, or in another version of the myth is a kind of satire again, or Pan,
yes.
Pan, another version of me, that Pan, who is like a semi-god, right? But he's not as important as Apollo, who is the god of music, by the way.
Exactly.
He's the god of.
So there he is, telling the god of music that he's not good enough.
He's not good enough compared to the modern. I mean, this is hubristic and it's considered to be, so he doesn't learn his lesson again, right? He's going in, and then he's punished again, and this time he's punished with the ridicule that he cannot, quite. He hides it, but eventually he cannot hide it because the secret will out.
But don't you think that's true? I mean, without taking it, which I like to do, sort of about how narcissism can turn into something psychopathic, because it is on that spectrum. But just on the narcissistic spectrum, eventually you are going to be made to look a fool, because what narcissists forget to do is fill themselves with skills and the real knowledge. They just assume it. They will steal from other people. They will just need that adulation so much that they don't care how they get it, and they don't care. Actually, it's not relevant that they are full of knowledge. They don't do the work. They just take it. They just steal it from somebody else.
Yes.
And in a way, that's the hubris that Midas did in the end. It's like, I am this god. I am the person in charge. I am the judge here, the judge and jury. But also what's so powerful is that it is his daughter that showed him at that initial point, sort of what happens if you are too narcissistic. And then his daughter can end up him not being able to have his daughter's love. But I do think that's the power of children.
Yes.
And show parents very often where they're going wrong, where they're going right. It can be painful for parents as well if they don't understand.
But I think what you mentioned, Maria, about knowledge and how they are, in many ways, they don't want to work hard to gain the knowledge. They want to study. They don't want to engage with knowledge. They don't want to ask the questions. They don't want to put the work in a way, to make to own it and work it and process it. So they much rather instead of, for example, reading a full book on Freud, they will read a Wikipedia entry, right?
Yeah.
So they will get the kind of knowledge, and then it's almost like they will get the supply they need, so they fail. Or if they find someone who is very knowledgeable, then they admire them and they really appreciate them, and they just stick to them as kind of leeches that they get them the blood supply they need from another, because they cannot provide it themselves. So that's why you see a lot of narcissists, being attracted to, admiring, but they're not really admiring, but very identifying special people, because they need to get the knowledge out of them, but without them doing the work of getting the knowledge. That somehow they will be infused with knowledge by the other.
Yes, totally.
By osmosis, by being related to another who is knowledgeable and done the work and feel special and intellectual, then they feel they can relate to. They feel they're special themselves by relating themselves to them.
Don't we see that a lot with celebrities? And everyone works with the celebrity. They're in that halo, that narcissistic halo. I work with so and so. And they are deemed to be even more special because they work within that sphere of celebrity, rather than gaining something themselves or doing something that is the status themselves. But that is, again, what happens with parents who don't fulfill their own lives. And if say, a father wants to be a footballer, and their son shows great football potential,
Mm.
you know, then that child becomes the apple of his eye. So the child becomes his footballer. And so the weight on that child, the burden, great if the child can live it out, but what if the child can't?
Yes, absolutely.
You know, and
We see a lot.
that happens.
We see it a lot with examples of celebrities and singers and performers who, their parents, in a way, they were the managers and coaches, right? I think I was reading somewhere about Beyonce, for example, that
her father,
right? There was this sort of, which of course invested all of this, but then Beyonce was simply an extension of his own ambition. It wasn't. He wasn't separate, and then it took her quite a lot to be able to separate and make herself, to identify herself as separate from her father. But this is what I mean. There is something about, especially quite a lot of performers who start from a very young age, with encouragement of the parents. There is something about fulfilling the parents' ambitions as a narcissistic extension of themselves, which, by having a child who is very talented and, performs well, then you feel that, you validate your own narcissistic, you get your own narcissistic supply. But you don't recognize the child as different and having your own needs. And of course, the children, because they want this love from the parent, they think they get this love from the parent, they will do anything to please them. Until, of course, a moment that they cannot do that anymore. Yeah.
But don't you think, if you look at somebody like Britney Spears, her father was her manager, and I think both her parents were. And then, but it gets to a point where the child can't exist without somebody like that. I remember being at a dinner and somebody came up, and he was quite a well-known agent. And I was talking to somebody who'd been on one of those TV programs. And he said, "Oh, I'm so sorry I've left you for 2 hours." But it was a dinner. It was a charity dinner. I said, "Oh, it's okay." He was fine. We were just chatting. But he sort of imposed his will on the artist. You need me. You need me to be your agent. You need me to look after you. They infantilize people. Parents can keep their child in an infant-like state, but the child themselves finds it very hard to grow up after that, because this growing up period with the parent is so important. Because the parent, they know the good enough parent. We're not talking about the special parent. We're not talking about somebody who's amazing. The good enough normal parent will enable the child to fall over, make mistakes, do things wrong, and bring them back to the center point, which is right. If they're not given that child will be an infant for the rest of their lives, potentially.
Yes.
So can a narcissist, and this is the big question, if they're brought up through a narcissistic parent or as a narcissist, where they are dependent on their parents, can they ever grow up through that? I wonder if that's going to be far too difficult as an adult to work their way through that without therapy. And we're not talking about counselors, we're talking about deep therapy that has to happen here.
Yeah. And not always that narcissists can actually benefit from. I mean, there is some hope. There is some sense of, benefiting from therapy and making sense that where the other starts to register. And there is a sense that you can exist independent of that sort of dynamic, of the narcissistic dynamic that is established between them and the parents, where they don't need to be, to remain in this infant state of, constantly needing to be satisfied by the other or provide a kind of narcissistic supply to the parent in a way, because to be in this relationship of neediness, mutual neediness in a way. It is possible, it can happen, but it's a very difficult work. Very difficult work, and it's sometimes is exhausting, and it is possible, but usually it happens when the narcissist arrives at a point where he runs out of narcissistic supplies, or there is a sense of his or her own image that starts to crack, and not to be able to maintain the integrity or the appearance of integrity, because there is no real integrity, the appearance of integrity that presents to others. And that usually comes with age, old age, right? So a kind of midlife crisis. usually happens around that it's very crucial. You know, with old age, or it happens with because youthfulness is also another. You know, time is not something that registers. They have to remain always infant. You know, in this infant youthful state, and you know, beauty and infancy and you know, appearance always valued as being quite doll-like, and you know, having the admiration of others is very important, right? To feel that you are admired and feel that you're beautiful and attract the attention of others. But then, you know, once this starts to go, then there is the narcissistic wounds start to appear. And then perhaps the pain of what happened and what, you know, and the choices you made in life start to come through.
And in a way, the story, what's so interesting, as you say, you know, he had everything. So that is like a child. If you take it from a child to an adult, he had everything. He was given the golden opportunity to have more. He then realized by having more, it could also ruin his own relationships. And then growing into adulthood, he didn't quite understand, you know, sort of where the gods were, what the right, the way of the world, let's say, power, the importance of power. And I do think people are missing that when they make money. What we're seeing over and over again in the corporate world, and you see it on Wall Street, and you see it here in all globally, people think that's the be all and end all. They buy their watches, they buy their houses, everything they want, their yachts and so on. And then suddenly, what else is there for them if they don't have a decent relationship, or if their children have left them?
Yeah, yeah. And they realize that, you know, with all the money and all the, you know, at the end of the day, you left with your golden sort of empty, but you feel very empty and deprived yourself. Like King Midas, now he's going to die from thirst and hunger, right?
Yeah.
And, you know, he lost his daughter, he lost the connections with his world, he turned everything to gold, but all the gold in the world cannot bring back what is important in life. And he's going to die, you know, from his greed, because that's what greed does. Greed does, it destroys. It's destructive, you know. In the attempt to turn everything into gold, you destroy it. You destroy the object that can keep you alive.
And that's where you know, and I know religion has bad press. And I'm not talking about that religion. I think religion needs to be transformed at the moment. But let's talk about the principles of a higher being, that you aim to become better, you know, as an archetype. I think, you know, the concept of God and the devil are good and very important for us as human beings to remember, to keep us in check, actually. And it doesn't matter how you look at them, you know, but to have somebody else that's bigger and better than you in your mind's eye and in your soul and in the depth of who you are is so important, to not think that you're a god, because that's what he did. He became the judge of a god. And
he became a god himself. He was more important than God.
He became more important than God.
But that's exactly what, you know, narcissism, pathological narcissism, because let's be clear here, narcissism is not always pathological, right? We need a certain level of
be narcissistic to a great extent.
You know, it's important for our survival, for our development. There's a healthy narcissism which has to do with accepting with self-esteem, self-worth, being able to share one sort of to receive praise and give praise, and without feeling ashamed or embarrassed about this, to be generous and to receive generosity. And I think all of these are part of a healthy narcissism. But there is some part of narcissistic sort of development that can go really wrong, and that can lead to something which leads to, you know, a very pathological and traumatic narcissism, which can be horrible for, you know, for relationships, for the individual, and fundamentally is built on an idea of an ego which is very fragile and very weak, and not a strong one, not one that relates, able to appreciate others, and feels in many ways godlike, you know. The idea of being omnipotent, omnipresent, outside time, you know, not affected by death. This is immortal in a way. all of these are attributes of God, of the gods. Right?
Mm.
You know, so as mere mortal, to think that you are immortal, you're omnipotent, omnipresent, omniscient.
Omniscient, absolutely. But
right?
don't you think this is happening at the moment?
All of these are characteristics of how mortals start thinking, you know, they are good, right? And then, of course, having this idea that we are mere mortals, even without the idea that there is a Godhead, right? But we are mere mortals, and we are, you know, we are limited. We are lacking. We are not going to be always, you know, always around. And death is part of our existence. We cannot just avoid it, right? And actually, we might not want to avoid it either, you know, necessarily at some point in our life, but towards the end of our life. But there is something about this which is very crucial, to limit our powers and feel ourselves that our powers exist within the sphere of what is possible. And what is possible is quite wonderful if you take advantage of it, you know. But I think there is something about this, you know, turning this life into this perfection, you know, life of perfection, impossibility, omniscience, you know, can lead to very traumatic aspects, both for the narcissists themselves, but also for others who relate to them.
But also, what money does at the moment, it can feed the minds of others who want to become gods. You know, we saw that with COVID, where scientists were saying, I am science. Like, instead of I am God, I am science. I am the bestower of all knowledge on the world. I know what is happening. I know how you can live your life. And I do think we're moving into a world where there's going to be this big disruption, where ordinary people who actually are not quite so ordinary, who know what the value of life is, and life is not money. Money is a way of living life, but it isn't everything. And as you say, and this is where Midas comes into play here, what is the cost of having all that money without the knowledge of the value of it? And that's why Dionysus said to him, are you sure you want to touch everything and make it into gold? Are you sure you want to? And yet nobody listens to that voice of, are you sure you want this? You know, and the daughter, once the daughter was lost, once he had turned his daughter into gold and she couldn't hug him anymore, that human contact is happening in life at the moment. And certain people recognize that, and they think, no, this is the value for me. Because I'm sure, like you hear about lots of people who are on their deathbed. And like you, I'm sure neither of us have ever heard somebody say, I wish I'd bought another yacht.
Yes.
It's always, oh my goodness, I need to reconcile a relationship. I wish I hadn't spoken to somebody like that. Or, oh, you know, can you tell so-and-so? And, you know, you heard it, we'd hear it over and over again on the fields during the war. Lots of young men would call for their mothers. You know, it was, where do I go back to for safety and security, but also for that love? What becomes so important? And I do think that people have started recognizing that money is not everything. And that need and greed for money, just where does it send you? We had The Wolf of Wall Street, so that was a great film that just that indication of what happens in the world. But lots of people do actually sell their soul to the devil. And say, I will do anything to make money.
Yes, I agree. And there is something about that we experience now. Of course, you know, for people who don't have money and they are really starving and they find it very difficult to make ends meet, especially during this cost of living crisis. Of course, money is important, and it is important to remember that. But I think the people who have so much that they cannot have any more, but they want even more, because this itself becomes a religion. I think, you know, Walter talked about greed, and especially, you know, the kind of the financial greed that we experience nowadays, and as another form of religion. You know, how much is enough, right? How much?
I think in our world we're just beginning to experience that. We've had kings who've had money, i.e. King Midas. And it was a true story. He did exist, and there was that essence that that his reign was, sort of very successful, very productive. But now this is global. Your power can be global. And we're seeing that what happens when people become global. And I do believe that the power really lies within the ordinary person. I agree with you. I think we should never be in a position now where people are hungry or needing financial support or without somewhere to live. That should be part of who we are as humanity. We just make that as a basic tenet of global humanity. Who are we as a race of people? And as a human race, we must look after others. And that's incredibly important. And as you say, everybody needs a certain amount of money. And you take that stress off people, especially when some people are overwhelmed with money. But they look the wrong way. They look the wrong way. They want to make themselves either more powerful financially or more powerful in terms of how they treat the world.
Yes.
Making food, sort of in a different way. So now they're talking about making meat in a laboratory.
Yes.
They're trying all sorts of AI and everything like this. And it's becoming so robotic, so detached, actually. It's almost psychopathic.
Yes, it is. There is that. I mean, it's removed, the more that you live in this fantasy world, that you feel that, you can create anything in terms of your own power and your own omnipotence, then you lose touch with what is real. And it becomes psychopathic. It becomes a sense of, almost psychotic, right? The sense of, being detached from what is real and what is possible. And then you create, you feel you can create the impossible. And then sometimes you might want to, I don't want this impossible. There are things that are real, things that we need to be concerned about. I don't want to achieve the impossible, Let's leave the impossible for another day. Let's deal with the issues we have where people are suffering and are really struggling, right? And I think this is what we're facing today. And it's really, sometimes, it's okay. We don't want to achieve another sort of billionaire in the moon, right? Or on the orbit of the moon. I don't care.
Yeah, exactly. You can only see so much.
If you orbit the moon, whoever Bezos or whoever this is, I just want I want something which is possible, and which is possible with the amount of money and the amount of productivity and the level of production we achieved in the world today. That nobody should go hungry, and I think this is a possibility.
It is. It should be.
And I think this is where Midas comes to remind us of of that greed, of that sense of and also it's interesting because in many ways he wrongs both the god of entertainment, music and fun, and and Dionysus, but also the god of knowledge, of music, of culture. So you have, in many ways, the combination of the Apollonian and the Dionysian is what creates the Greek tragedy, right? Is actually the Greek culture. The Apollonian and the Dionysian is the thing that brings a kind of balance between a life of pleasure and a life of knowledge.
Absolutely.
Right? And between truth and desire. Right, the two, between knowledge and desire, between the sense of these two, they need to coexist, and there needs to be balance between the two. And Greek tragedy is created out of this combination. And Greek culture, in a way, in the ancient Greek, created a kind of the means. The esoteric, mean is the definition of tragedy is by bringing these two together and creating something beautiful in order to express the truth of tragedy, but the truth of the tragedy of life, but also to be able to bear it in an Apollonian kind of way. But the thing is that Dionysus and Apollo, they exist side by side, and Midas, goes, he pleases Dionysus, but he also offends him, by using the power that was given to him for fun in a very abusive, hedonistic way, in excessive way, in excessive way. And then he offends Apollo as well. So he's offending both the principles of Greek life. And of course, you have to remember that he's not Greek. The Greeks have chosen a king who wasn't Greek. He was from Phrygia, who wasn't.
He was an outsider.
He was an outsider. To describe that he doesn't live, everything according to moderation.
But something you've said there is so important, the truth and the desire. But don't you think this is where I think Freud went wrong in his theory? Because he had an opportunity to create an impact with his theory, and he skewed it incorrectly. He, instead of sort of giving it to the parents and sort of saying to parents, you've got to look at how you influence the child, blah, blah, blah. He says it comes from the child. And of course, the child's going to want everything. That's what we're talking about. That's the nature of a child. I want, it's oceanic, it's omnipotent. I want everything. And a parent has to teach a child, no, this is the real life. This is the life that you should be leading. And truth comes in that. And there has to be a universal truth. Because at the moment, there's this idea of my truth. No, yes, there's your view of an accident, but there's a reality in that accident.
But I think with Freud, you have a version of that, but it comes with Oedipus complex, the no of the father, right? There is the sense that, you can't have everything. You can only have what is you can't have. You can't have your mother. You can't have your power. There are differences between genders and between generations, right? This is what the Oedipus. You can't be everything. You can't have everything. You can't want everything. You can't want what you can want. You can't get what you want. You can want what you get.
Yes. Or what you see.
What
you want it, you can't really
because we can get. I think if I want it, I can get it. That's another, right? I can get what I want, always. But, it's different, let's see what you can get, and then you can start wanting, and I think this is the task of our lives. Whereas the narcissist remains in this, well, I want it all and I want it now.
Yeah. But don't you think our culture is a bit more Dionysian at the moment? That it allows people to get what they want financially. So they give them that.
Not really. You see, this is the problem. It's not really Dionysian because, Dionysus doesn't exist in isolation. He also exists with a pantheon. And I think, for Dionysus to exist, he needs to be with other gods. He cannot be on his own.
On his own,
so, a purely hedonistic culture is not really Dionysian. Dionysian festivals were arranged throughout the year in order to be able to give, to experience pleasure and hedonism as part of life, because we need it as well. We shouldn't be puritanical about this. We need to honor the body and its desires. And I think the Greeks knew that, and that's why they had Dionysian festivals. And actually, the tragedies were performed during the Dionysian festivals, right? To honor Dionysus. But you see, the thing there is that, if there isn't, these are seen as moments, opportunities for something to come into but life as well. The Greeks realize it's not just fun and enjoyment, there's also suffering, which is unavoidable. There's loss, there's death, there's suffering. So, you need these moments of catharsis. You need these moments of but then you need to put it within the context of a larger life, of Apollonian knowledge and truth, in order to matter. Otherwise, it becomes simply hedonistic. So the life that we live is not Dionysian. It's actually is a perversion of Dionysus.
Yeah, exactly. So I agree, because they're trying to isolate that without the whole context of where the Greeks were intending this. And I totally agree with you. And I think this is where people are suffering, because they're not contextualizing it effectively. They want to, as you say.
The pleasures of the body, of food, having good food, good sex, good life. I mean, they are important to us. We should have them, but they come within the context of our responsibility to ourselves and others. And the suffering and and all the other truths of life, you know, our desire and truth and desire, they should work hand by hand, right? Truths, the multiple truths we have about our life and desires, they should work hand in hand, and they should be either in conflict but in tension with one another, instead of giving the, you know, rise to one or the other, right? A life without pleasure is also a very austere life, and we don't want either, right? But a life only of pleasure, then it misses out something very important, which is, you know, our responsibility to others, and our responsibility to that we cannot exist just on our own. We cannot just, you know, like with Midas, realizes, if I turn everything into gold, there is nothing remain. I will be on my own, and then there is nothing. I will die.
Yeah, totally.
There's nothing left for me here. That's this exactly.
He can't nourish himself.
He can't nourish himself, and actually, he won't have anyone to be able to exhibit his wealth, and you know, and
nobody will tell him how amazing he is. That's right.
Exactly. Even in that, you know, the tragedy. That's why narcissists, you know, of the Midas type, they are quite, you know, they end up being very miserable, and you know, that's why the old age realize that they have cut all the links that keep them alive and keep them sustained. And since the narcissistic supply start to die one after the other, and then you're left, and you can't use your influence, your beauty, you can't be seductive, manipulative to do that. You end up very, very quickly realizing that, you know, you need others. And once you start feeling that, then you become very miserable and very, very, very afraid. And I think, you know, some of them get there earlier than others, but some of them that also never realize, and it's a waste of life, you know. You know, for a narcissistic, pathologically narcissistic individual, let's put it that way, there is a certain level of sadness, you know, of a waste of life. You know, it's a wasted life. It's a life wasted on something that is not fulfilling and is not nourishing.
But don't you think that people aren't taught how to look at life? I mean, we are here for a small period of time in reality. So I always look at timelines in different lengths, if you like. So we have the instant where great things are happening, and you know, that goes quickly, and terrible things happen and that goes slowly. But suddenly, you know, sort of when you're 10, life, you're never going to be 20, and that, you know, sort of that 10 years is eternal. And then suddenly from 20 to 50, it's like, where's it gone? And then so on. And time changes, but suddenly you realize you're only here for a short period of time. What are you going to do with your life? How do you view your life? That's why I love mythology. It gives you an opportunity to review your life at every opportunity. That's why I love theatre, the correct theatre. You know, because Bruno Bettelheim did a lot about this, the uses of enchantment, and talked about a lot of this, and he had some of his followers at Marie-Louise von France, and of course Dreamwork does that. It becomes your own internal theatre where you can review your life. What is the value of what I'm doing here? And to find your value, to find something that really excites you, that isn't financially led necessarily. It could be, that's great. But what do you do with that when you've got it? How do you use it productively to make the world a better place? That you're not just here for yourself. And as you say, it is a relationship. You are in relation to the world. You're not in isolation. So when you think about, as I said, you know, nobody says, I want another yacht. And what does a yacht signify? You're out at sea on your own, basically. And who wants that really in their lives? You have no relationship with anybody. You're not there amongst the community. But
the narcissistic fantasy is that I will create a community which I will rule, and everybody will admire me because I have all this money, so I can buy the love and admiration. So I don't need really to relate truly to others. But you know, that's one thing that is very easily recognized by that. That if you use or manipulate or seduce others into admiring you and giving you what you want, you very quickly realize that this type of love is not worth its soul, because it's taken out of seduction and manipulation, or out of buying, you know, buying it, you know, through your money. but it's not something that is worth its all because it's not given freely and spontaneously.
Mm. But
It's
then,
not given to the subject. It feels like you have controlled the other and giving you what you want. It's not something. It's almost like you make them need you, want you in a certain way, right? You hook them into you, so in a certain way. So it's not really that they do it because of choice. They do it because there is some form of seduction, manipulation that you make them want you in a certain way, so as to for them to give you what you want, which is the admiration and the love that you need. But that love is not, that's why the narcissistic dynamic always pays its price, because the love that you get is never enough, because it's not given freely, it's not given spontaneously. And of course, the moment that you get it, it doesn't last long, because it's like a drug, right? It gives you a high, but then it goes away. So you need constantly to receive it.
But and that supply, as we see with a lot, as we come back to celebrities, because they're the easiest people to see. They are our theatre, aren't they? They're the ones we reflect on in life. And that's why they have to move from one person to another to get that intensity of that love, that early stage, honeymoon stage of, I really love you, you're the most amazing person in my life. And they go on once that's lost, because the person will never supply enough, as you say, but also they don't supply the other person. So they're always going to be at odds.
Yes.
What the other person wants, which is they want what the other person gives them, which might be true love, but the person in the relationship won't get their true love, and they don't get enough narcissistic supply because they lose interest in each other. You're just not fulfilling each other ever. And I think that is the narcissistic contract that always ends up in some type of very painful, very, and I think either the narcissist, gets off someone and it moves to the next supply, or when they are rejected and they feel this immense pain, how can you remove this withdrawal effect? How can you take away my supply? They cannot stand it. They feel almost like the whole being is annihilated. It's almost like if I don't have that, I can't exist, right? Yeah, so how dare you take it away? So they move from trying to control, worm their way back, try to get it back, to move to the opposite extreme, which is, getting enraged, threatening, making, stalking you, making all sorts of threats to be able, they will use every trick in the book to be able to lure you back. And once, of course, you haven't given in for a while, then they lose heart, and then there's nothing for them to, they realize they cannot get it, then they move to something else. But, it takes quite a while, and people underestimate the tenacity of narcissists. They can stay for years. I know. I think the hardest thing, this is why it's such a wonderful story, the King Midas, as a story for people to recognize that it's so enticing to be the person that can get the gold, but it's vacuous, it's empty, and avoid that at all costs, because this is the outcome. And Dionysus, although he's the god of lust, love, wine, all those hedonistic things, he was warning him. If you carry on like this, this is what you're going to get. Are you sure you want this?
Are you sure you want this?
Yeah. And he didn't heed the warning. And people don't heed the warning.
They don't heed it. But actually, it's very, in the continuation of the myth, when he's punished with ashes ears, because and then he was punished for his hubris, for being an ass, really. And he was. And then of course, it's how these things can never be contained, that eventually, they will come out. However much the truth will out, however much you try to keep it in, to make it, eventually will leak, as it happened with, he tried to bury it, but eventually the reeds.
The truth always comes out, doesn't it? But I do think, and don't you think if it's the beginning of life, you're allowed to be narcissistic as a child, and then gradually you've got to grow up, and he had that opportunity to recognize Apollo as the god. You are the god of music, truth, wisdom. And he didn't. He saw himself far greater. So he becomes an ass. He ends his life as an ass.
Yes, yes.
You know, who wants that?
What is the legacy that he left behind, right?
Yeah, what is the legacy there?
Yes, I think it's very interesting because, Gordon was the city of Phrygia, right? That was his, and then there was the Gordian knot talking
Yes,
about,
yes.
and this is what Alexander, who comes later.
Mm.
He says, and in many ways, this is his way. If you are not the Gordian knot, if you are able to untie it, then you can be the ruler of the known world all the time. So people tried and they never could untie it. So he takes his sword and just cuts it through and just splits, which of course is in its simplicity shows also the violence of power and authority. But then there is something about, if you tie yourself in knots, the only way to cut through the bullshit is through cutting it through it.
But don't you think that's true? To a great extent, people go round and round in circles over things. And I quite like the idea of cutting through something as well. So you're quite right. It has that, sort of negative element, the guillotine that cuts off somebody's head. But at the same time, if you, as you say, if you cut through the bullshit, you get to the truth.
You get to the truth. That's what.
And you've got to do that. And I think that's what the therapist's job is. To help somebody cut through, because most people go round in circles within themselves.
And that's what helps, that's the work with narcissists. You cut through the bullshit.
Yeah.
You cut through all the smoke and mirrors, you cut through all the seductiveness, all the manipulation, and you put really a mirror against themselves.
Yeah.
You say, this is what you're doing, this is what you do to others, these are the consequences, this is what is happening. And eventually there is a hope that they might be able to see it, and gradually they consider the other. But it takes a lot of work, and you need to actually see through them, see through the bullshit and give it back to them. But, to be honest, for someone, a narcissist to arrive in therapy, it's very rare.
I know, but you often get their partners in therapy.
Oh, yes.
and they have to carry it for both of them.
Absolutely. That's true, because they are...
They're the ones that are receiving everything. They're the ones that are carrying the burden.
They are not narcissists themselves. We live the narcissist vicariously through the other, because the narcissist wants an echo.
And yes, I totally agree, but I don't know if it is and it isn't. Sometimes you get caught in that and
you're right.
You're trapped.
You're trapped. There is.
Also, there's this wonderful thing in life, isn't there? Oh, that you should look after people, you should help them, you should forgive them. There's this wonderful element of forgiveness, and I just think that's too big a burden for most people. Why forgive? No, walk away.
Walk away. Yes,
walk away if you can, without harming others, but do it cleverly. And people aren't taught how to walk away, how to protect yourself, or just never go there in the first place.
Go there, but sometimes if you are there, run.
Yes, you've got to somehow get out. But if you've got children, it makes it hard. I think, so it just depends. But very often in therapy, you get the partner who is trying to work out, how do I, and it depends, as you say, how deep is the other person in their narcissism? Or are they just so traumatized for whatever reason that they can't face therapy themselves?
It varies. There's not one sort of, there isn't just one. As with narcissists, this is just one type, right? There are many types. There are some more, some less. And there are conditions that can help someone get closer to some realization, some who, you can find something there that is possible to work with, but with some others it might be, it's a waste of time.
And I think they know that. And eventually they end up with ass's ears.
Yes.
Because they'll lose their supply, and that's what they face at the end of their lives.
But it's not, but then again, we need to realize that narcissism is not something that happens solely. I mean, there are the pathological types, It's something that we all contain, and we all have the possibility of coming to that if we are not careful. We can all turn into this sort of, even in moments in our lives, we can become really this narcissistic and disregarding of the other. And this is also our own struggle. It's easy to project to these narcissists all these our shadow in a way. But we need to look sometimes in our own elements and find our own narcissistic components. Especially, you know, some therapists that they think that they are the best things, right? And they need to actually look at their own narcissism when they are with people, and they need to be careful not to vilify and make these people the kind of the carriers of projections for anything negative that happens that needs to be eliminated. And I think that can become persecutory. And instead of looking at, you know, there is narcissism in all of us, and it depends. Sometimes it can turn into something nasty if we're not careful.
And in a way, that's why we need other people.
Yeah.
To tell us, and we need to recognize that and have that truth reflected back to us. But I agree, we need to be narcissistic, or else we won't move forward.
Yeah.
You know, we need to think that we can do something well. I don't like the sort of, not that I don't like it, but the old Buddhist thing of, you know, transcend your ego. No, you need your ego. You need to move on. You need to believe. You need to have faith. But why are you doing it? How are you doing it? Who are you? Be mindful of yourself. And yes, you're right. We can all be narcissistic. And some narcissism is good for you. So we should create that cologne that you just spray it on when you need it.
Spray it when you need it.
So then it's external and you know that you're in charge of it rather than it's being in charge of you. But yeah, it's tough. And it doesn't matter which walk of life you're in.
Yeah.
You know, as you say, with therapy, it can happen.
It becomes, unfortunately, sometimes, and it doesn't matter what walk of life you're in, sometimes it becomes a screen through which you can't see but only a reflection of yourself. Right? So we need to be careful when we see someone else, we see them, but we don't see, perhaps it's also a reflection of ourselves. So we need to be mindful of that.
Well, that's what Jung said, wasn't it? If somebody irritates you, look at what is it in you that they reflect.
Exactly.
And that is such a good way to look at life, but not too much, because you'll tie yourself in that Gordian knot.
Exactly. Sometimes you need simply to cut it and run away.
And cut it and run away, exactly. And on that note, such a great talk. Always a great discussion. And who would have known there was so much in King Midas?
Oh, it is. We won't have the time.
Exactly. So Anastasios Gaetanides, thank you so much for today's discussion on King Midas. And I'll speak to you soon.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye.
Bye-bye.